So we move on to the next dynasty, the Tudors, and of course we start the early modern period. More and more residences will survive and the castles will be gradually replaced by splendid palaces, more decorative and luxurious. But as you'll see, the fortifications and churches will be important as well. But let's start with Henry VIII. Not all of his palaces survived, but the one that he liked especially fortunately does, and I mean Hampton Court. On the outskirts of London, a very important royal residence which was rebuilt for at least 3 dynasties: the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the early Hanoverians. And if we look at the oldest part of Hampton Court, the part that was built from red brick, which was a new and very fashionable material at that time in the 16th century, we have the parts built for the early Tudors. Initially for Cardinal Wolsey, he was the man who commissioned it, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but Henry VIII loved this place so much when he visited that he basically gave Wolsey no choice but to give it to him as a present. He did it quite a few times in his reign. He was quite thrifty with the money, so if he liked residence, he just demanded it to be given to him rather than build something himself. So if we look at the early Tudor period, we have a lot of beautiful residences made from red brick, like the older part of Hampton Court, and also other residences like, for example, Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which was the home of Anne Boleyn, the second quite notorious queen of Henry VIII, who ended her life in the Tower of London. So we have all those places, the older places, the Norman places, still serving their purpose and being important in the royal history. If we talk about the Tower of London, we can of course mention the Princess in the Tower, so the young sons of Edward IV, Edward V and his younger brother, who were staying there, as the tradition was before the coronation, in London, and were never seen again. Probably murdered, maybe, as the legend goes, by their uncle Richard III, so the one who was killed at Bosford Field. There we go. Another whole section of historical buildings and interesting monuments connected with the Tudors, and especially with Henry VIII, are the ruined abbeys. So I hope you all remember the marital problems of Henry VIII, which ended with the proclamation of the Church of England and the dissolution of the monasteries. It meant basically destroying and robbing the famous, very rich abbeys that were in very many places in England. Some of the places are quite renowned in history and even literature, like Tintern Abbey in Wales. Here you have it on top photograph. That used to be a powerful abbey, destroyed by the orders of Henry VIII, but also inspirational for artists in the late 18th century, in the 19th century, painters, poets like William Wordsworth, who wrote one of his very, very famous poems about this magnificent ruin. Another abbey that you may recall from our earlier classes, Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, now in a ruined state, part of the UNESCO site really, with some places, some residences near it. But of course there are lots more that can be mentioned as far as those destroyed abbeys go. Some of them quite famous, like Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, connected to the legend of King Arthur. We'll talk about it next time. Bolton Abbey in Yorkshire, Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire, Netley Abbey in Hampshire, Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, also a beautiful, huge Gothic place connected with the early medieval synod of Whitby, and also some interesting legends and literary connections. We'll talk about it next time. But we have quite a lot of those beautiful romantic ruins that survived in a good state before the Tudors. Another type of buildings connected with the early Tudors are castles, but a new type of castles, coastal castles. Castles built as a defensive line of forts against a possible French or continental invasion after Britain became England, then, so it's before Britain, before the unification. After England became a Protestant country, they increasingly feared the invasion, the military invasion from the continent, from France and later Spain. Of course, remember the Spanish Armada, so there were attempts to bring England back to the fold of the Catholic countries. And to be prepared, Henry VIII started building those new modern coastal castles, less spectacular than the medieval castles, but better equipped to modern warfare, to the cannons and new siege techniques. So they are in the south, of course, along the coast next to the English Channel. So the so-called device forts such as Deal Castle in Kent, Pendennis Castle in Cornwall, and Southsea Castle in Hampshire. Sometimes they used parts or fragments of older fortifications, sometimes they were built anew, but as you can see, they are more regular in their form, and they are better equipped to the modern, meaning 16th century modern warfare. Since we are talking about the Tudors still, of course, after the death of Elizabeth I, we have the unification of England and Scotland, connected with James I or James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, a very famous, very inspirational monarch whose cultural presence is very visible. So two places connected with Mary Queen of Scots. One is Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. We talked about it a little bit when we mentioned Edinburgh. The royal residence, the new royal residence, opposite the old royal castle in Edinburgh, still used as a royal residence, but originally starting from the 16th century, and the ruins, very destroyed ruin of Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire, which was the place of Mary's imprisonment and eventual beheading. Speaking of Elizabeth I, we have here some places, some residences built not by the Queen, but for the Queen, by the aristocrats, by the courtiers who are looking for royal favor. Elizabeth was even more thrifty with the money than her father Henry VIII. So she didn't build any new residences, but she encouraged her courtiers to build wonderful, modern, luxurious palaces and invite her. Sometimes they used already existing places that were modernized, like Kenilworth Castle, that belonged to her favorite Earl of Leicester. But here we have two more examples: Burghley House in Cambridgeshire and Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire. The second one is quite interesting because it was never finished. And the owner believed that he would be granted some royal favors and the Queen would visit him. Unfortunately, she never came, and the spectacular palace with beautiful windows with lots of chimneys, so all the new modern domestic technologies that were fashionable at that time was never completed. Then, of course, we have the period of the Stuarts, which is cut into two halves by the Civil War. So the moment when many of the old castles that survived the Middle Ages were destroyed or demolished to actually during the warfare or to prevent some sort of backlash from the sides of the nobility, either siding with the parliament or more often with the king. We have two interesting places here. One is the only remaining part of Whitehall Palace in London, called the Banqueting House. This palace was a very big residential building in central London. It was unfortunately destroyed during the Great Fire of London, and only one room, or really one building, because these were like separate pavilions, survived. Whitehall Palace, a kind of the banqueting house, that is the kind of room for feasting, for entertaining, for dining, which also boasts a beautiful ceiling decoration made by Rubens, one of the great continental artists, invited to work for the British royal family. When the Parliament side won the Civil War, the king was imprisoned and tried for tyranny, and eventually he was beheaded. The scaffolding was built outside this building, outside the banqueting house in London. So this was the last place which Charles I visited in his life. The other building is a manor house in Shropshire, which is quite famous because this is where the Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Charles I, also called Charles, hid and was saved by the royalist family during the Civil War, and he could escape to France. He later was invited back to the throne during the period of Restoration, and he became King Charles II. If we look at the building projects of the Stuarts, especially the second half of the reign of this dynasty, we have the new wings of Hampton Court. As you can see, it's in a completely different style than the old Tudor part. It's more regular. It's in the continental style that was fashionable. That was fashionable then, much more comfortable as well. And also we have another of the UNESCO sites, that is Royal Naval College in Greenwich, and this was one of the big projects commissioned by the later Stuarts, incorporating the oldest building, the one seen in the middle between those two large towers, which comes from the reign of James I. And this was called the Queen's House because this was a hunting lodge for the wife of James I, Queen Anne of Denmark. And the last of the Stuart monarchs is also called Queen Anne. She was the niece of Charles II, the daughter of his brother James, and her reign is characterized also by the period of wars with France, very successful wars with France, led by her great military commander, the Duke of Marlborough. And here we have another UNESCO site from the Stuart period, namely Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, the spectacular, very big residence commissioned by Queen Anne as a present, as a kind of thank you gift for the Duke of Marlborough and his wife, who was one of the Queen's ladies and advisors. And if you watched the film The Favourite, this is the woman who was the old favourite of the Queen. After Queen Anne died childless, so none of her many children did not survive. They were either stillborn or they died in childhood. When she died, the new dynasty was invited to the throne from Hanover. So the Hanoverians, they are sometimes called the Georgians because at least first 4 kings from this dynasty were all called George. This is also the dynasty that Queen Victoria belonged to, and to some extent we might say they continue to reign, although by a different name. We'll talk about it in a moment, but let's look at the early Georgian residences, early Georgian architecture. So Kew Palace in London, the family home, you might say, the London family residence of the early Georgian kings, especially remembered for King George III and his very numerous family living there, and also Kensington Palace, originally built by the late Stuarts, but then used by the Georgians as well. So Kensington Palace in London. This is the birthplace of Queen Victoria as well. So that's why we have this monument of young Queen Victoria, a rather rare occurrence. She's usually remembered as the elderly matron from the period of her jubilees, but this is the monument showing Victoria as a newly crowned, very young queen. This was placed in front of Kensington Palace, her birthplace, and it was actually made by one of her daughters. She had very many children, 9 children, and some of them were quite gifted, like Princess Louise, who was a sculptor. But before we move to Victoria, we have George IV and his spectacular summer palace in Brighton called the Royal Pavilion. And as you can see here, this is a pleasure palace. This is something that looks like a combination of Taj Mahal with perhaps something from a Chinese fantasy. This was the palace that was used for pleasures for balls and parties and feasts, and this is the early 19th century when people were discovering the English seaside, and this is really the beginning of seaside holidays, and the royal family led the way. Next we have two summer houses, summer residences of Queen Victoria herself. Of course, she mostly spent time either in Buckingham Palace in London, which she started to use as the main royal residence, and it has remained the main royal city residence until this day, or in Windsor Castle, which is one of those very old castles built even before the Norman times, and then used by all the monarchs basically later on, so it was extensively used in the 19th century as well. But here we have two residences built or extensively rebuilt for Queen Victoria. One is Balmoral Castle in Scotland, and the other one is Osborne House on the Isle of Wight in the English Channel. So these were the places she visited for private holidays, to entertain her family, her private guests, and they were built according to her specifications by her and her husband, Prince Albert, who was quite a talented, maybe not architect, but decorator. So especially Osborne House, but Balmoral Castle as well, bears a lot of his personal taste and his will to please Queen Victoria. And after Victoria died, after a record-breaking reign of almost 64 years on the throne, more than 63 years, her eldest son took the throne. He didn't rule for a long time. He took the name of Edward VII, and here we have his principal residence, the residence that was given as a present, as a wedding present from Victoria to Edward VII when he was still the Prince of Wales, and he married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. This is the royal residence of Sandringham in Norfolk, which is still used by the royal family, and it is open for tourists. I actually managed to visit it. It's very interesting, but only during the periods of the year when the royal family is not living there. This is quite true about many of those residences. They are actually still living homes, including the two principal residences of Queen Elizabeth II, namely Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. So Buckingham Palace, built originally for the Duke of Buckingham, one of the important courtiers of earlier monarchs, but it was obtained by the Hanoverians through some sort of legal machinations, and from Victoria's reign onwards it became the principal home of the monarchs in London. So one of the important buildings in London. Only relatively recently it was opened to tourists, again, it remains to be used for its original purpose, that is royal residence. This is where the famous balcony is situated, so all the occasions like weddings and jubilees and everything, they are marked usually by the royal family appearing on the balcony, being greeted by the crowds. The other residence, the older residence, is Windsor Castle in Berkshire, near London. This is one of those castles with a very, very long history, and I decided to end with this one because it even gave the name to the royal family. So the current dynasty on the throne is called the Windsor dynasty. They are no longer called the Hanoverians. They never really used the name of Victoria's husband, Prince Albert of Saxon-Coburg-Gotha. During the First World War, Victoria's grandson, George V, decided that the royal family needed a new surname, a proper English surname, and he decided to use the name Windsor from the main castle belonging to the royal family as the name for the family. So that's it about the royals, and let's now talk about other interesting residences and the institutions that take care of them.